In his former command position, Fritz Berline stood. Around him, the landscape looked like the surface of the moon. The date was July 25, 1944. His Polar Lair division had just been reduced to rubble by American aircraft. Berline had engaged in combat with the British throughout North Africa. At Eliming, he had served under Rommel. He knew how to combat a systematic foe that launched waves of attacks that were predictable. However, this was not the same dot. This was total destruction. 2 more Shermans emerged for each Panther his crews. Destroyed. American jet aircraft descended from the sky and transformed his tanks into flaming coffins as they attempted to relocate. What the Americans delivered to Normandy was described by his men that there was no strategy for surviving it in any German textbook, and they referred to it as material Schlag, or the struggle of material. German commanders in France faced 2 Western adversaries by the summer of 1944. They each had tanks. They each possessed artillery. Both desired to drive into Germany after pushing through Normandy, but they battled in entirely different ways. The British were professional and methodical. After years of combat in Italy and North Africa, German leaders had mastered the rhythm of their attacks. The Americans were very different. They were violent, disorderly, and supported by an industrial machine that appeared to be able to make up for every defeat in an instant. The British were revered by German commanders. They knew how to deal with them. They were afraid of the Americans. And how the conflict played out in the West would depend on this distinction. Clear's throat. German leaders referred to the methodical sledgehammer as the British approach. Every time it was a set-piece combat, the artillery arrived first. Massive. Barges that could last for hours, eating into German forward positions with devastating accuracy. Eastern Front veterans asserted that they could sleep through a Russian onslaught. British fire, however, was distinct. It was accurate. It was unrelenting. Long before the first tank showed up, it made men nervous. The tanks then arrived. Behind a wall of exploding shells, hundreds of them advance in formation and grind forward. But there was a pattern. The British would halt their initial advance after 5 or 10 miles. They would bring up supplies, secure their flanks, and cement their successes. As the commander of the 21st Polar Division, Hans von Luck saw something exceptional in fighting the British. In the afternoon, they would take a break. The British paused to make tea. His troops laughed. It wasn't tea. It was doctrine. Clear's throat. The British were meticulous, cautious, and reluctant to go too far. And that predictability was something German commanders could use. German commanders employed a mobile defense strategy known as the backhand blow. The idea was straightforward. Don't commit the Panzer reserves right away when the British attack. Allow the British to move forward. Allow them to use up all of their energy against the forward defenders. Then, when the British halt to consolidate, and they always stopped, launch the counterattack. As they were reorganizing, strike them. Before they can dig in, hit the flanks. It took courage. It seemed insane to watch the front line crumble while keeping your best forces at bay, yet it worked against the British. The British would advance. Clear's throat. Most of it would be recovered by the German counterpunch. The cycle would continue after the front stabilized. The operation. This theory would be disastrously demonstrated by Goodwood, southeast of Caen. On July 18, 1944, the British began their biggest armored thrust of the Normandy campaign. The Operation Goodwood attacked German fortifications with 3 armored divisions and more than 1,000 tanks. The German forward line was reduced to a seething wasteland when the attack started with 2,000 bombers. It should have been a breakthrough. The tanks moved forward. The bombardment caused the initial German line to vanish. British officers saw the growing momentum. The advance then slowed. After that, it stopped. British armor started to be picked. off by German anti-tank guns positioned in depth. From hidden locations that the bombers had overlooked, the fearsome 88mm guns opened fire. British tanks burned on the open area southeast of Caen. The British withdrew when the Panzers launched a counterattack. They lost more than 300 tanks in 3 days. The front line hardly moved at all. German commanders were grimly satisfied with the outcome. Once more, the backhand blow had been effective. Although they were unpredictable, the British, clear's throat, posed a threat. The Americans then arrived. The Americans began Operation Cobra from the other side of the Normandy battlefield, a week after Goodwood. They started with heavy aerial bombardment, just like the British. Poner was buried by line in his own command post after the carpet bombing devastated him. However, what transpired was not at all like a British assault. After bursting through, the American tanks continued. They continued to go and clear's throat. On August 1st, George Patton's Third Army went into action. Patton failed to consolidate as American tanks raced across France in a matter of days, paralyzing German leadership. He failed to protect his flanks. He urged his tank commanders to bypass resistance, keep going, and let the follow-up forces deal with pockets of Germans left behind. German leaders bided their time till the Americans stopped. For the backhand blow, they positioned their reserves. There was never a pause. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's chief of staff was General Gunther Blumenritt. He described why American armor was so challenging to combat after the war. He said the Germans considered Patton the most aggressive general they faced. Patton fought more like a German Poner general than any other Allied commander, according to Blumenritt. He was a risk-taker. He took advantage of opportunity. He took action before the German decision-making process could react. Patton was a mess. Where German intelligence claimed they couldn't possibly be, his units showed up. Before German commanders realized the Americans had gained ground, his tanks appeared at a crossroads. The traditional German counter-strategies were predicated on the enemy pausing. Patton's doctrine explicitly barred halting. He wasn't the only issue either. American fighter bombers had a moniker among German soldiers. They referred to them as Yabos, which stands for Yak Bomber. The skies over France belonged to the P-47 Thunderbolts. They were always circling, keeping an eye on every road and pursuing everything that moved. The crews developed a psychological ailment as a result. Because they were always looking up at the sky, men's necks became permanently stiff. There was more to the far-off sound of an engine than just danger. They were the prey, and the hunt was underway. German tank commanders discovered that it was fatal to move during the day. Clear's throat. Within minutes, the Yabos would dive after spotting the dust cloud from a Poner column. The road would become a burning cemetery due to rockets, explosives, and machine gun fire. This made it impossible for the Germans to launch a counterattack. In order to hit the enemy's flanks with the backhand stroke, Puner reserves had to be moved. However, relocation meant death. German tanks waited for nighttime while hiding under trees and netting. The Americans had already made 20 more meters of progress by the time night fell, and they were able to move. The British were also superior in the air. However, the Germans had never encountered the integration of American tactical air power with ground forces. American tank commanders might call in airstrikes within minutes. Furthermore, it didn't appear to matter when American tanks were destroyed by German gunners. Fighting American armor seemed discouraging to German commanders. The wrecked tanks continued to reappear. When a Panther was knocked out in battle, it was typically a complete loss. There were no recovery vehicles in Germany. There weren't many spare parts. Additionally, any damaged tanks left behind were permanently lost as the front moved. American recovery crews operated differently. As the gunfire continued, they proceeded onto battlegrounds. They dragged the wounded Shermans back to repair depots after hooking wires to them. By the next day, tanks that had been hit in the morning were back in action. Within hours, crews that managed to survive a brewing Sherman were given new tanks. The German commanders thought they were up against a hydra. After one head was severed, two more emerged. For a pony crew, it was a very depressing event. After eliminating the adversary and wiping perspiration from your eyes, they reappear 10 minutes later. It deprived German leaders of the one thing they required to continue fighting. The conviction that their successes were significant. WWII personally witnessed this. His Panthers had killed American tanks. It was irrelevant. The Americans had more every time. They had more. They also never ceased coming. In contrast to the British, Erlin detailed what Cobra had done to Poner during his post-war interrogations. He said that rather than being vanquished, the division had been completely destroyed. His locations had become a moonscape because to the American, bombing, the blast waves turned tanks upside down. Without ever seeing an adversary, crews perished. Then, the American armor arrived, overwhelming every defensive position in a deluge rather than the methodical British approach. This was the real meaning of material schlock, a conflict in which industrial production was more important than military might. German leaders received maneuver warfare training. They thought that greater crew training and tactics could overcome the numerical disadvantage. None of that mattered when it came to the Americans. Everything in its path was simply crushed by the weight of explosives and steel, and the nightmare was just beginning. By mid-August, the German position in Normandy had disintegrated. American forces had rushed around the German flank, while British and Canadian forces attacked from the north. The German 7th Army was trapped in a pocket at Files. The only way out was through a small opening that Allied forces were working hard to seal. What transpired in that enclave came to represent the capabilities of American weaponry. On the roadways, German columns attempting to flee were apprehended. American aircraft strafed them continuously. Every escape route was hammered by artillery. From hundreds of feet in the air, pilots flying overhead said they could smell the odor of death. Drivers had to shield their faces in order to breathe in the apocalyptic scene of twisted steel and swollen corpses. In the pocket, between 10,000 and 15,000 German soldiers perished. 50,000 more were apprehended. The equipment losses were disastrous. The German army had everything it needed to keep fighting, including tanks, artillery, and transport vehicles. A few units managed to slip through the opening, but they weren't fighting formations. Rather, they were broken fragments. In France, a Wehrmacht had been breached. Hans von Luck made it through the conflict. He considered battling both the British and the Americans in his memoirs. He respected the British. He referred to them as gentlemen troops and professionals. They fought hard, but they fought within limits that German leaders could understand. The Americans were not like that. Despite their lack of tactical skill, Fons were unpredictable due to their overwhelming material abundance and propensity to take chances and keep pushing even when their flanks were exposed. Staff Officer Friedrich von Mellentine made a direct comparison of the three main adversaries in his book Poner Battles. The British were cautious experts. The Russian population was erratic. German tactical advantages were neutralized by the Americans' combination of material supremacy and hostility. The British had answers in German doctrine. What the Americans brought to the battlefield was beyond its comprehension. It wasn't the tanks themselves that taught German commanders to be afraid of American armor. The Shermans' armor and firepower were not superior to those of the Panther or Tiger. They were afraid of what American armor offered: unending replacements, continuous air support, logistics capable of sustaining an advance over hundreds of hundreds. Miles and leaders like Patton clear's throat, who would not allow tactical caution to impede the assault. Patience and timing could be used to oppose the British. It was only possible to put up with the Americans. German leaders on the Western Front had given up on defeating American forces by 1945. By exchanging space for time that Germany no longer possessed, their only goal was to postpone them. The methodical sledgehammer could make it out alive. The swarm might